When I decide something will be mine, it becomes mine, one way or another. Henry Blackwell wrote that 3 days before he murdered Catherine Murray. His journal named at least 7 victims, and this is his creepy, dark history. Welcome back to another deep dive into the most chilling cases in American history. Today we're heading to the mountains of Kentucky, to a place called Harlan County, where, in the bitter winter of 1923, a series of events unfolded that would shake the foundations of an entire community. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the monsters that hide in plain sight. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Have you ever had that gut feeling about someone that turned out to be terrifyingly accurate? Share your story with us. The year was 1923, and America was in the midst of the Roaring Twenties. Jazz filled the speakeasies of big cities, flappers danced until dawn, and prosperity seemed to touch everyone. Everyone, that is, except the people living in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky. There, in the coal mining regions of Harlan County, life remained brutally hard, unchanged for generations. Harlan County was coal country through and through. The mountains were honeycombed with mines, and almost every man who could work descended into those dark tunnels each morning, risking their lives to extract the black gold that powered America's factories. The work was dangerous, the pay was meager, and the company stores kept families perpetually in debt. But it was the only life most people knew. The community of Pine Hollow was one of dozens of small mining camps scattered throughout the county. About 300 people lived there, most in company-owned houses that lined the narrow valley floor. There was a general store, a small church, a one-room schoolhouse, and not much else. The nearest town of any size was Harlan, about 15 miles away over mountain roads that became nearly impassable in winter. Life in Pine Hollow revolved around the mine. When the whistle blew at dawn, the men went to work. When it blew at dusk, they came home, exhausted and covered in coal dust. Women raised children, tended gardens, and tried to stretch every penny as far as it would go. It was a hard life, but it was a predictable one. Until the winter of 1923, when that predictability shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Catherine Murray was 21 years old that winter. She was the eldest daughter of a coal miner named Patrick Murray and his wife Rose. Catherine had 4 younger siblings, ranging in age from 6 to 17, and she helped her mother with the endless work of keeping the household running. She was known throughout Pine Hollow as a beautiful young woman with dark hair, bright green eyes, and a quick smile that could light up a room. Catherine was engaged to be married to a young miner named James Porter. They had been sweethearts since childhood, and everyone in Pine Hollow expected them to marry in the spring. James was saving every penny he could, hoping to have enough to rent a small house of their own, maybe even buy some furniture. Catherine was carefully sewing her wedding dress by lamplight in the evenings, using fabric her mother had been saving for years. But there was someone else who had taken an interest in Catherine Murray. His name was Henry Blackwell, and he was the mine foreman, a position of considerable power in a company town like Pine Hollow. Henry was 38 years old, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier along with the baby. He lived alone in one of the better houses, a benefit of his position, and he had a reputation for being strict but fair with the miners under his supervision. Henry Blackwell had come to Pine Hollow 5 years earlier in 1918 from somewhere in West Virginia. He had references from mining operations there, and the company was satisfied with his credentials. He knew coal mining inside and out, could read the seams and the timber like a book, and had a talent for maximizing production while keeping accidents to a minimum. The company valued him highly. To the people of Pine Hollow, Henry seemed like a decent man. He attended church every Sunday, sitting alone in the back pew. He paid his debts promptly. He never drank to excess or caused trouble. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, Rose Murray sent her second oldest daughter, 17-year-old Mary, to look for her. Mary ran to the store and found it closed, which was unusual for that hour, but not unprecedented if business was slow. She knocked on the door of the storekeeper's residence above the shop. The storekeeper, an elderly man named William Cox, came to the door and confirmed that Catherine had been there, had made her purchases, and had left around 4:30 p.m. He said she was heading straight home. But the 200 yards between the store and the Murray house had somehow swallowed Catherine completely. Patrick Murray, despite his exhaustion from a long day in the mine, immediately organized a search. He gathered a dozen men, and they scoured the settlement with lanterns, calling Catherine's name. They checked every building, every shed, every place she might have taken shelter from the cold. They found nothing. The snow that had fallen throughout the day had covered any tracks she might have left. It was as if she had simply vanished into the winter night. By midnight, the entire community was involved in the search. Women prepared hot coffee and food for the searchers. Children were kept inside, frightened by the panic in their parents' voices. And still, there was no sign of Catherine Murray. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Garrett, was notified, but he couldn't reach Pine Hollow until 2 days later due to the snow-blocked roads. By then, Catherine had been missing for 48 hours, and the community was in a state of barely controlled panic. Sheriff Garrett was an experienced lawman, 55 years old, and hardened by years of dealing with the violence and chaos that coal mining communities often produced. But even he was troubled by Catherine's disappearance. Young women didn't just vanish from settlements this small where everyone knew everyone and strangers were immediately noticed. Garrett began his investigation methodically. He interviewed everyone who had seen Catherine that day. William Cox, the storekeeper, repeated his account. Several miners had seen her walking toward the store in the afternoon. A few women had nodded greetings to her, but no one had seen her after she left the store at 4,000. Garrett then did something that made everyone uncomfortable. He asked about Henry Blackwell. The story of Henry's unwanted attention toward Catherine had spread through the gossip network, and Garrett heard multiple versions of it during his interviews. He learned about the proposal, the rejection, the confrontations with Patrick Murray and James Porter. He learned about the sudden change in work assignments that seemed like retaliation. Garrett decided he needed to speak with Henry directly. He found him at the mine office going over production reports. Henry received him courteously, offering coffee and expressing appropriate concern about Catherine's disappearance. When Garrett asked about his whereabouts on the evening of December 14th, Henry had a simple answer. He had been home alone, as he was most evenings. He had no one to verify this, being a widower living by himself, but he pointed out that dozens of people could confirm he hadn't left his house after returning from the mine at 6 p.m. His house was on the main road, visible from multiple other residences. Someone surely would have noticed if he'd gone out. Garrett asked about Henry's interest in Catherine Murray. Henry didn't deny it. He admitted he had asked permission to court her, had been refused, and had accepted that refusal. "I'm a lonely man, Sheriff," he said calmly. "I thought perhaps Miss Murray might consider building a future with someone who could provide security. Her father declined on her behalf, and I respected his decision. That's the end of the matter." "Is it?" Garrett asked. "I've heard you've been making life difficult for Murray and young Porter since then." Henry's expression hardened slightly. "I assign work based on my needs and worker capabilities, Sheriff. If Murray and Porter find themselves in more challenging sections, it's because that's where they're needed." Nothing more. Garrett wasn't convinced, but he had no evidence of any wrongdoing. He couldn't arrest a man simply for having made an unwanted marriage proposal. He needed something concrete. The search for Catherine continued for another week, expanding far beyond the settlement boundaries. Men searched the surrounding forest, checked abandoned mine shafts, explored caves and ravines. They found nothing. The winter landscape had swallowed her without a trace. As the days passed with no breakthrough, the community's grief began to mix with anger and suspicion. People started looking at Henry Blackwell differently. Conversations stopped when he approached. Men who had previously respected him now avoided his gaze. The cold distance that had always characterized him now seemed sinister rather than merely antisocial. James Porter was devastated. He had lost not only his fiancée, but also any hope for the future he had been planning. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, spent every spare moment searching for Catherine even as others began to give up hope. His family worried he was losing his mind to grief. The Murray family was destroyed. Rose Murray aged 10 years in those 10 days. Patrick stopped going to work, unable to face descending into the mine when his daughter was missing somewhere in the cold. The younger children cried constantly, not fully understanding what had happened, but feeling the weight of their parents' anguish. And then, on Christmas Eve, 10 days after her disappearance, Catherine's body was found. A young boy named Samuel Henderson, only 12 years old, was playing in the woods behind his family's house when he noticed something strange. There was a small ravine about half a mile from the settlement, a place where rainwater had cut a deep gash in the hillside. Samuel had played there many times, but this day he noticed something different. A piece of cloth was visible at the bottom of the ravine, partially covered by snow and dead leaves. Samuel climbed down carefully and found Catherine Murray's body wedged between two rocks at the bottom of the 15-foot drop. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing when she disappeared, her purchases from the store still clutched in frozen hands. Samuel ran home screaming, and within minutes, men were racing toward the ravine. Patrick Murray was among the first to arrive, and his anguished howl when he saw his daughter's body echoed through the valley, a sound of pure grief that everyone who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Garrett was still in Pine Hollow, staying at the small boarding house while he investigated. He was notified immediately and hurried to the scene. What he found there would transform this from a tragic disappearance into a murder investigation. Catherine's body was carefully removed from the ravine and brought to the church, the only building large enough and appropriate enough to serve as a temporary morgue. The county's medical examiner, Dr. Marcus Webb, arrived the next day despite the holiday to perform an examination. Dr. Webb was thorough and methodical. What he discovered painted a horrifying picture of Catherine's final hours. Catherine had not died from a fall. There were injuries consistent with having fallen or been thrown into the ravine, but those injuries had occurred after death. The actual cause of death was manual strangulation. The bruises on her neck showed clearly the pattern of large hands squeezing until life left her body. There were other injuries too, bruises on her arms and wrists, suggesting she had been forcibly restrained, defensive wounds on her hands where she had tried to fight off her attacker, and evidence of sexual assault confirmed by Dr. Jar. Webb with a grim expression that said more than words ever could. The medical examination revealed something else crucial. Based on the state of the body and the temperature conditions, Dr. Webb estimated that Catherine had died within hours of her disappearance, probably that same evening. She had been killed somewhere else, then transported to the ravine and dumped there, probably in an attempt to make it look like an accidental fall. Sheriff Garrett now had a murder investigation on his hands. And he had a suspect. Henry Blackwell's house was the closest residence to the ravine where Catherine's body had been found. The route from the company store to the ravine passed within 50 yards of his property, and Henry had no alibi for the critical hours between 4:03 p.m. when Catherine left the store and 6 p.m. when he claimed to have arrived home from the mine. Garrett obtained permission to search Henry's house. What he found there was damning. In a locked room in the basement, hidden behind a false wall that Garrett's deputies almost missed, was a small chamber. It contained a filthy mattress, chains attached to the walls, and personal items belonging to women, jewelry, locks of hair tied with ribbons, photographs, articles of clothing, a collection of trophies from victims. Among these items, Garrett found Catherine Murray's engagement ring, the ring James Porter had given her just 6 months earlier, a simple silver band with a tiny stone that had cost him 3 months' wages. There was more. In a wooden box, Garrett found a journal. Henry Blackwell's journal, written in his own hand, documenting his obsessions. Page after page described Catherine, her movements, her habits, his fantasies about her. The entries grew increasingly dark and violent as they progressed, revealing a mind consumed by possession and rage. The journal also mentioned other names. Other women. Entries going back years describing women Henry had known in West Virginia before coming to Pine Hollow, descriptions of how he had dealt with women who rejected him. It was a confession written in his own hand, a chronicle of evil stretching back at least a decade. Sheriff Garrett immediately issued a warrant for Henry Blackwell's arrest on charges of murder, sexual assault, and suspicion of multiple additional murders. Deputies were dispatched to bring him in. But Henry Blackwell was gone. His house was empty. His belongings were still there, but the man himself had vanished. It appeared he had left in a hurry, probably within hours of Catherine's body being discovered. He must have realized that once she was found, the investigation would inevitably lead to him. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Kentucky history up to that point. Sheriff Garrett sent telegrams to law enforcement agencies across the state and into neighboring states. Henry's description was widely circulated, his photograph distributed to hundreds of sheriff's offices, But the Appalachian Mountains were vast and unforgiving. A man who knew the terrain could disappear into thousands of square miles of wilderness, and Henry Blackwell knew the mountains. He had lived and worked in them for years. He understood how to survive in harsh conditions, how to move undetected through the forests, how to avoid civilization when necessary. Meanwhile, the journal provided crucial evidence that helped answer long-standing mysteries. Garrett contacted law enforcement in West Virginia, sharing information about the names and dates mentioned in Henry's writings. What they discovered was chilling. At least 4 women had disappeared from the mining communities where Henry had previously worked. All were young, all single or recently widowed. All had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Local authorities had investigated but found no leads. The cases remained unsolved until now. With Henry's journal as a guide, searches were organized in West Virginia. Over the next several months, the remains of 3 women were discovered in remote locations near Henry's previous residences. One victim was never found, likely buried in a location Henry had documented or in terrain too dangerous to search thoroughly. Catherine Murray's funeral was held on December 28, 1923. The entire community attended, cramming into the small church until people had to stand outside in the cold. James Porter was a broken man, barely able to stand even with the support of friends on either side. The Murray family sat in the front pew holding each other, their grief a palpable presence that filled the room. Reverend Michael Carson delivered the eulogy, speaking of Catherine's kindness, her bright spirit, her stolen future. But his words seemed inadequate in the face of such senseless violence. What comfort could there be when a young woman's life had been extinguished by the selfish brutality of a man who saw her not as a person, but as an object to be possessed? The trial of Henry Blackwell would have been one of the most significant in Kentucky legal history. But there would be no trial because Henry Blackwell was never caught. For months, reported sightings came in from across the region. A man matching his description was seen in Virginia, in Tennessee, in North Carolina. Each report was investigated, each led nowhere. It seemed Henry had perfected the art of disappearing, of moving through communities without leaving traces, of evading capture through careful planning and ruthless execution. Sheriff Garrett dedicated the remainder of his career to finding Henry Blackwell. He maintained files, followed every lead, coordinated with dozens of other law enforcement agencies. But Henry remained a ghost, present in everyone's nightmares but absent from the physical world where justice could be served. The years passed. The 1920s became the 1930s. The country plunged into the Great Depression, and life in places like Pine Hollow became even harder than before. Many mining operations closed, families scattered in search of work elsewhere. The community that had been so traumatized by Catherine's murder slowly dissolved, people carrying their grief and fear to new locations. James Porter never married. He lived his entire life alone, working in various mines across eastern Kentucky, dying in 1967 at the age of 64 in a mining accident. Those who knew him said he never recovered from losing Catherine. That part of him died that winter night in 1923. Patrick and Rose Murray moved away from Pine Hollow in 1925, unable to bear living in the place where their daughter had been murdered. They settled in a small town in Tennessee, trying to rebuild their lives, trying to find some measure of peace. Rose died in 1941, Patrick in 1948. Their younger children grew up, had families of their own, but the shadow of what happened to Catherine haunted the Murray family for generations. Sheriff Garrett retired in 1938 without ever apprehending Henry Blackwell. In his final report, he noted that the case remained open, that Henry was still wanted for murder, that anyone with information should contact authorities. But Garrett privately believed that Henry was likely dead, a victim of the harsh mountain winters or some violent encounter in his fugitive wanderings. But was he? Over the years, there were persistent reports of disappearances that bore Henry's signature. In the 1930s, a woman vanished from a mining camp in Virginia under circumstances eerily similar to Catherine's case. In the 1940s, 2 women disappeared from different locations in West Virginia. In each case, the women were young, attractive, and had recently rejected the attention of a mysterious older man who worked at the local mine and seemed to have no traceable past. Were these Henry's victims? Or were they coincidences? The tragic result of living in dangerous times in dangerous places. Without concrete evidence, it was impossible to say. The journal Henry left behind was preserved as evidence, eventually making its way to the Kentucky State Archives where it remains today. Researchers and true crime enthusiasts occasionally request access to it, always emerging shaken by the casual brutality of Henry's writings, the complete absence of remorse or human empathy. One entry, written just days before Catherine's murder, is particularly chilling. Henry wrote, "She thinks she can refuse me. She thinks that boy can protect her. They don't understand that when I decide something will be mine, it becomes mine. One way or another, she'll learn. They'll all learn." It's the manifesto of a man who saw other people not as individuals with their own agency and choices, but as objects to be controlled and possessed. And when that control was challenged, violence was his inevitable response. In 1975, more than 50 years after Catherine's murder, an elderly man died in a nursing home in Alabama. He had been living under the name George Wilson, claiming to be a retired railroad worker. He had no family, no close friends, no one who really knew him. When his few belongings were inventoried, staff found a small leather pouch hidden in the lining of his suitcase. Inside were photographs of young women, a lock of dark hair, and a small silver ring with a tiny stone. The nursing home contacted local police, who in turn contacted the FBI. The photographs were compared against missing persons cases going back decades. 3 of the women in those photographs were identified as victims from unsolved disappearances in Appalachian communities during the 1930s and 40s. The silver ring was sent to the Kentucky State Police. After careful examination and comparison with descriptions from the original case file, investigators concluded with reasonable certainty that it was Catherine Murray's engagement ring. Was George Wilson actually Henry Blackwell? The timing fit. He would have been 90 years old, the right age. But without fingerprints on file from 1923, without DNA technology available at that time, there was no way to definitively prove identity. The body had already been cremated as per the man's prearranged funeral plan. If it was Henry, then he had successfully evaded justice for his entire life, living freely while his victim's family suffered, dying peacefully in his sleep rather than facing the punishment he deserved. It's an injustice that gnaws at everyone who studies this case. But perhaps there's some small comfort in knowing that he spent those final years alone, friendless, living under a false name and always looking over his shoulder. That's not justice, not really. But it's something. The Catherine Murray case remains officially unsolved. The warrant for Henry Blackwell's arrest is still technically active, though everyone involved in the original investigation has long since passed away. The case file sits in the archives, a testament to a young woman whose life was stolen, a community that was shattered, and a killer who almost certainly got away with murder. There are lessons here. Painful lessons about the danger of men who see women as property, about the importance of trusting instincts when someone makes you uncomfortable, about the failures of systems that allow predators to move from place to place, leaving destruction in their wake. Catherine Murray deserved better. She deserved to marry James Porter that spring, to build a life, to have children, to grow old surrounded by people she loved. Instead, her life ended at 21 in violence and terror because a man couldn't accept that she wasn't his to claim. The mountains of Kentucky still hold their secrets. Deep in those hollows and ridges, there may be other victims we'll never find, other families who never got closure. Henry Blackwell's journal mentioned names that were never identified, locations that were never pinpointed. How many women fell victim to his obsessions? We'll probably never know the full count. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you or made you think about the importance of believing victims and taking threats seriously, then please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this video. Catherine's story deserves to be remembered not as sensationalist entertainment, but as a reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face, that the most dangerous people are sometimes those we see every day without truly seeing at all. And leave a comment. Do you think George Wilson was really Henry Blackwell finally identified after all those years? Or is Henry still out there somewhere, his fate as mysterious as the location of his victims? History may never give us definitive answers, but the conversation matters. These stories matter. These victims matter. Rest in peace, Catherine Murray. Your story will not be forgotten.